Hi, my name is Calanthe. You might know me as Rebecca, but these days I prefer to be called Callie. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kent. I'm in my 4th year part-time, which puts me a bit over halfway. But the road here has been anything but easy. I went pretty much straight from my master's to my PhD. What's important about this is that midway through my master's degree, not only did the pandemic hit, but I also became markedly physically disabled. Now, I'm not new to being disabled in general. I'm autistic and I've had pretty severe mental distress and trauma for all of my life. In fact, for the decade before I started my master's, I'd been unable to work at all. In many ways, just as I started to see that I might be able to do something with my life, the rug of that hope was pulled out from under me. Suddenly, I was constantly fatigued and in full body pain unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. I began to get other symptoms too, things that I would later come to recognise as grouped under dysautonomia: palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, unexplained viral symptoms. So I began a quest to find out what was wrong. It wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, and a lot of doctors disdainfully told me it was just anxiety along the way. But eventually, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and hypermobility. Later, after catching COVID, I would then add long COVID to that list. Over the next few years, my ability to mobilise myself without crippling pain deteriorated to the point that I'm at now, where I use a wheelchair in order to be able to leave the house. I'm always in pain, regardless, but the way I'm able to function at all now is by minimising additional pain as much as possible. As you can imagine, this complicates doing a PhD somewhat. If you were to ask me how I'm managing it, and people often do, I wouldn't have a simple answer. I've taken an intermission at one point when I literally couldn't do it, but then I also continue to work through my divorce and 3 house moves because my PhD was all that was allowing me to feel like I wasn't a complete failure. I have incredibly supportive supervisors, friends, and an academic mentor, all of whom help keep me going when I don't think I can. I was also fortunate for the first couple of years to be dependent upon someone with an income high enough that I could pay my tuition fees okay, even though I didn't get any kind of scholarship. I've been trying to get scholarships the whole time, even coming close at points, but they've never materialised and are increasingly not available. These days, I put aside a large amount of my now much more meagre income so that I can pay my tuition each year. Even that I'm lucky to be able to do. Although granted, to achieve that, I do live in a flat that is essentially a postage stamp. But truthfully, I think the most important thing is that, well, I've got a lot of experience with going through shit. I was 33 when I started my PhD, and I'll be close to 40 when I finish it. I've had a lot of privilege, but I've had a lot of trauma and difficulty too. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's surviving. I survived a series of suicide attempts while I was an undergraduate student, and honestly, ever since, I've had a sense that I'm both blessed and cursed to keep going no matter what. Not that I'm an incredibly positive person either. I'm a really hopeful person, but a lot of my life just doesn't feel great, you know? I'm in constant pain, the autistic experience of this neurotypical world is awful, and a lot of the time I'm just so fucking tired of being so fucking tired. I struggle constantly to feel like I'm worth anything. The things I say to myself are truly brutal. I'm internally in need of reassurance and of evidence that I'm worth the air I breathe. Which, I suppose, is why we're here. Video proof that I am reckless enough to keep trying, even though everything in me is screaming to give up. So on that happy note, let's talk about my PhD. Perhaps the thing one becomes best at whilst doing a PhD is explaining what your PhD is in. The trouble is, over time, this can become over-rehearsed or rote, or meaningless as you say the same words over and over again until they no longer feel like words at all. So instead of just telling you what my PhD is in or about, let me tell you why it matters to me. For almost all of my life, my main defensive mechanism has been escaping. This began with just reading when I was a child. As I became a teen, it turned into finding the internet and video games and fan fiction, which turned into finding role-playing games as an adult. I'm only alive and only the person I am today because of the games that I played, the books that I read, and the worlds that I was allowed to escape to. In escaping to those worlds, I don't always want to wholly shed what makes me me. Which means I didn't want to imagine myself without my disabilities or my autism or even my trauma, just as I also almost always imagine myself as a woman. In fact, when I create characters now, I think very carefully about the parts of myself that I want to bring in and why. This is what I wrote my master's dissertation on before later publishing it as a book. In my PhD, I've taken it a step further, looking not just at role-playing, but at where I can find people like me in all kinds of interactive media. Because to me, there is a very specific quality about embodied madness that is very difficult to explain in words. We have words for some of the states I find myself in, but they're either drawn from the pathologization of psychiatry or simply not sufficient to explain it. I can tell you that I feel anxious or confused or overwhelmed, but for example, overwhelmed doesn't work as a word to describe how my entire body can start itching because I feel so deeply uncomfortable that I can't remove an external noise or get away from some material that feels scratchy and horrible or can't calm the world down in some way. These affective elements of the mad experience are things that I think interactive media is perhaps the best place to put across. So that's what my PhD thesis does. It looks at 4 different media types, all of which are interactive in different ways and to different degrees, and it asks, where are the mad people here, and what can we learn from them? Because I know they're there. They've been with me the whole time. I've written 2 chapters thus far. As a part-time PhD, my PhD will last about 6 years, a little bit longer most likely due to COVID extensions that at my institution you're eligible for if you started during the height of COVID. So with my introduction and conclusion given some time and the start of the PhD being a bit slower, I've got all told about a calendar year per chapter. The first chapter I wrote was my chapter on video games, where I focused on Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice and Heavy Rain, which you can find me giving conference papers and other talks about in my existing videos. My second chapter was on fanfiction, where I did a study finding out what fanfiction authors and readers think and feel about madness in fanfiction, and how they choose to explore it or how they choose not to explore it. My current chapter is on visual novels. This chapter is particularly challenging because there simply isn't a huge amount of scholarship out there about visual novels, let alone madness in visual novels. A lot of what I'm doing in terms of my research is just that, novel. I'm looking at 2 visual novels in particular. Slay the Princess, a Canadian authored horror novel about identity and relationship, and Song of Saya, a Japanese horror eroge novel about Lovecraftian horror, madness, and humanity. And to be completely honest, right now I'm at the hardest part. I've done a lot of basic research into each visual novel, into horror in general, into Japanese horror in particular, and now I have to work out what it is I'm trying to say in this chapter, or what it is I'm asking, and how I'm answering those questions. This is incredibly challenging because it requires me to place at the front of my thinking what it is that I, as the researcher, think is the most important. And I struggle so much to think that what I think matters at all. So, if I'm honest, that's why I want to start making these videos. I used to stream on Twitch when I was doing my master's degree and early on in my PhD, showing the process of my work. The thing I miss most about that, as much as live content creation doesn't work for my particular madness, is getting to talk through things verbally, because I find that I very much need to verbalize things in order both to make them real for myself and to think through them actively. So that's the plan. Thank you for being here, and for as long as I'm able to sustain this, and really as long as it serves me and my work, welcome to my little corner of the internet, where we ask, where are the mad people, and what do they have to say?